Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Remaker's Mark. Here we are in the second edition of our What's Up Doc series, where we will be discussing hot coffee. With me, as always, are my friends Andy Wicks, Jeremy Nilsson, Lee Hot Coffee, and Mark Joesting. Just a reminder, this is the second in our What's Up Doc series where we are discussing documentaries that we individually know of, but don't think that a lot of other people know a lot about. So the previous one was Jodorowsky's Dune, which was my pick. And this one, Hot Coffee, is Lee's pick. Lee, tell us about why you chose this documentary.
Well, I've always enjoyed documentaries that are about a topic that seems to be part of popular culture and general knowledge, but nobody really knows all the details. And, you know, a documentary like Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, or Bowling for Columbine, they tend to go into deeper detail about the event and things that led up to the event and other things that are related to the event. That's why I picked this documentary. I saw it years ago on Netflix as one of those things that came up as recommendations because I had watched something else and thought I would give it a try because I saw that they were talking about, in their description, the hot coffee case with McDonald's that happened back, I believe, in the 90s. And I remember that being a very big topic for discussion. It was in the news a lot. It was late night talk show hosts were making fun of it a lot. And it sort of became like the case that everyone would point to for, you know, when they were talking about frivolous lawsuits. And in watching this for the first time, I had no idea what the specifics of that case were, and I was really shocked to find out. So I thought that it's a really well-made documentary, and it covers a lot of really interesting legal points. So yeah, that's why I chose it.
Right on. Very good. As we did in our previous episode and what we did in our Hidden Gem series before, which kind of inspired this What's Up Doc series, we're going to briefly talk about kind of what we knew about this documentary specifically, and in this particular instance, what we knew about, or what we thought we knew about that particular lawsuit that Lee mentioned. So Andy, why don't you start us off? One, did you know anything about this documentary specifically? And two, what did you think you knew about the McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit?
I did not know anything about this documentary prior to Lee bringing it to our attention, but I felt like I was one of those people interviewed at the beginning of the movie when I think it was the woman's daughter or daughter-in-law told an anecdote about how people often think they know what happened in this case, but they really don't. And I was definitely one of those people. What I knew of the case was that a woman got coffee from McDonald's and spilled it on her lap and then sued. And I assumed incorrectly a lot of things about the circumstances of that case and then just simply didn't know 98% of what actually happened.
I was in the exact same place. I did not know anything about the documentary, and I was exactly where you are as far as the lawsuit goes. Jeremy, how about you?
Interestingly enough, I actually was working at a McDonald's in 1992 when this happened.
Interesting.
I remember hearing about it, but there wasn't, at that point, there wasn't any lawsuit or anything that happened later. But I have, and I could be totally wrong on this. This could be a false memory created by this story later, but I feel like we all talked about it a lot and how, you know, there was this sort of rumor or old wives' tale or whatever about the, you know, burning coffee or people burning themselves with coffee to sue McDonald's or whatever. And as with everybody else, I had a completely distorted view of what actually happened during this. And as far as the documentary, I knew that the documentary existed, but I had never seen it before.
And Mark, how about you?
I too had never heard of the documentary, and thought I knew something about the lawsuit, but knew nothing about it. So I'm in the same boat there.
Gotcha. Thank you for that summary. Before we talk about the movie itself, I wanted to give just kind of a quick summary of it, because one thing that's very interesting about the movie is that it at face value, or kind of the cover of the book, if you will, is about that McDonald's coffee lawsuit, and certainly that was pertinent. However, the movie itself only delves in that just a little bit as kind of one of four different examples of how the civic or civil justice system is kind of doing individual consumers or individual people wrong, and why. So the first case that was referenced is that of the woman who spilled coffee on herself and where the blame lied for that. The second one was a woman who was pregnant with twins and who, as a result of malpractice by her doctor, one of the twins had severe brain damage. And so it was with that they focused on damage caps specifically. The third one was a judge in Mississippi who happened to be a friend of John Grisham, strangely enough, and who wrote a book essentially about his plight, who basically was not pro-business first and foremost as a judge, and went through hell and back in his role or in his attempt to become a judge, and basically was kind of driven out of town almost as a result of that. And then the final one was a woman who worked for Halliburton, who, as a result of an arbitration clause in a contract, was not able to take Halliburton to court after some pretty terrible things happened to her while she was working for them abroad. So again, there was kind of the start of this coffee case, but the entire documentary spread out across lots of different things around how consumers and citizens have been done wrong by the changes to civil justice. Anything else that you guys want to add to that I missed?
Just that they led us through all those cases really well.
Mm-hmm.
The coffee lawsuit was a really, really nice gateway into the land of civil justice for the whole documentary.
Yeah, I appreciate how they sort of built layers, and they started with the hot coffee case and built on top of that to the next thing, and they had a really good structure to the documentary in kind of building up these sort of 4 points that they were trying to make.
So let's maybe go one by one here as far as the specific cases, just to get a little kind of our thoughts of it and the overall impression of it. So start with the hot coffee one. That one, is certainly the most well-known of all of these, I believe. And as a result of that, I think, certainly kind of taps into the cultural zeitgeist. One of the techniques that they use in the documentary is interviewing people to ask what they think they know about that. In some kind of shows like the Jimmy Kimmels of the world or whatever, that's done in kind of a gotcha way. This isn't in a gotcha way, but it is truly in a way where you realize just how ill-informed kind of the general populace is about a lot of things. And in this particular one, it was about that lawsuit itself, where everyone thought that she was driving, that she poured it on herself, that, all these things that very, very much put the blame on this woman who spilled the coffee and was hurt as a result of that, when in fact the truth could not be farther from that, where she was the passenger in the car. She wasn't driving. They had pulled aside into a parking spot at the McDonald's. She was trying to take the lid off to put cream and sugar in, and that's when it spilled. And they actually show images of the burns and the skin grafts as a result of that. And they are
yikes.
Just absolutely traumatic. They are just horrible. Absolutely horrible.
Yeah. To give a little medical perspective on those burns, they appear to be partial to full thickness burns with some, looks like failed skin grafts and some infection. It's far worse than you would probably expect. Everyone's probably spilled something hot on themselves at some point. And while it's certainly uncomfortable, it doesn't typically cause, flesh damage. And this poor woman who was she was 79, I believe, when it happened.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And as her family was saying, was completely independent. And, I think it had even just retired. Hadn't she just retired very shortly before this happened?
2 weeks prior or something like that. Yeah.
So she's a, lively woman that's been, certainly wasn't infirm. But when you spill, what was likely an entire cup of coffee onto her inner thighs and can't get away from it. You can't immediately open the door and jump out. I'm sure she couldn't move that quickly, that it caused some really, really serious damage that required multiple surgeries. What I thought was interesting about that case in particular was that her family initially only wanted McDonald's to pay for whatever Medicare or Medicaid wasn't going to cover for her medical bills. Because I think at the time that they inquired, she had like tens of thousands of dollars in medical bills. And so all they were looking for was essentially coverage for the medical costs. McDonald's came back with an offer of $800.
Yeah.
And then which is then when they started to go into looking at a lawsuit. But it wasn't my impression, and maybe I'm wrong, but it wasn't the woman seeking this damage of millions of dollars. It was the jury that awarded it to her. Am I getting that fact right from what you guys understood?
Yeah. So it was they reflect upon punitive damage, and they define punitive damage as damage that basically makes it so that corporations pay attention. Right.
Yeah.
So it's such that,
policy changing damages.
Exactly. So that they are forced by a meaningful monetary ding to make a change so that this doesn't happen to them again. Exactly.
Yeah. So it was my understanding, it was my understanding that this woman who was burned did not say, I want $2.9 million. It was the jury saying, this is what we feel you deserve for getting for your trouble and to put this message to McDonald's. And what the public, I think, understood, what I certainly understood in my own understanding of this case prior to seeing the documentary was that, it's a frivolous lawsuit. It's this woman who's trying to get millions out of this giant corporation, when in reality, it didn't seem like that was the goal of the lawsuit. It was really to cover her medical costs and to establish a policy so that this wouldn't happen to other people. And they even talk about how they interview this executive at McDonald's who they're telling him, there's been 700 cases or complaints about hot coffee. And he said something like, I'm surprised there's not more. I'm thankful there's not more.
Yeah.
Something like that. Jared, did you have something you wanted to say about this?
Yeah, to tag along with that, what was fascinating about this particular segment in the documentary to me is how much effort and money was put into making sure the public believed what we all have now believed years later, that this was a frivolous lawsuit by a woman trying to get money. And the creating that public perception and changing it to a horrendously warped view succeeded. It did what they were trying to do with all of that money and effort to change that, so that they could start putting all of these weird rules and laws in place, so that we as individuals have less and less ability to hold corporations accountable. And that was the part that sat me back in my chair, that this lawsuit was kind of a jumping off point for a lot of pretty terrible things to happen from a larger standpoint.
I think they even used the term, it was the victim of its own success.
Yeah.
The second case that was discussed there was that of a woman who was pregnant with twins that we spoke of. I don't recall how far along in the pregnancies, I think third trimester certainly, but went into a doctor's appointment because the babies didn't seem to be moving quite as much as they usually do. And they did a very rudimentary, just very cursory review and listened for heartbeat. And actually, the heartbeat was the second phase. Ultimately, what happened was, when you have twins, you can either have one placenta or two placentas. If there's one placenta, there's a good risk that basically resources are not being shared equitably between the two fetuses, and that is what happened to them. Whereas with two placentas, it's more likely that things are balanced the way that they should be. Andy, you're the doctor literally in the room. Did I do a decent job of that?
Let's clarify. I have a doctorate degree, but yes, you did explain that pretty clearly, that with the shared placenta, the risk became that one twin was going to essentially hog more of the resources than the other, which could stunt growth, just put it at risk for a lot of birth defects. And then because the doctor didn't order the
ultrasound.
Thank you. Well, they didn't. They must have just done like a sonic heart monitor to hear the heartbeats, but they didn't do an ultrasound. Yeah, I think that's right. So had they done an ultrasound, they would have seen, there's only one. Or they did see that, and another doctor saw it. I think there's the details, and said, you need to deliver right away. They got to the hospital. They mentioned something about the standard of care being that they need to deliver within 10 minutes of arrival. They didn't deliver until 2 hours later because a doctor couldn't show up. And then in that time, the one twin essentially suffered anoxia, or a lack of oxygen, which causes kind of global brain damage. It's widespread. It's hard to predict what's going to be affected, what's not. But in this particular case, it was profound, to a point where that child was born. One twin was born healthy, and the other one was born at a level where they are going to need care for the rest of their life.
Yep. This was not necessarily about the malpractice, though that was the reason why they went to court. The reason why this was focused on in the documentary was because throughout the trial, it was found that malpractice was committed. However, when they did the actual awarding of the monetary value, so they said basically, numbers people did numbers people things to determine, based on the amount of brain damage and how that affected this particular child, how much care they are going to need for the rest of their life as a result of this malpractice. And they came up with this number of $6 million, right? So this would be $6 million to basically take care of this person for his entire life. So they kept saying, the parents kept saying, when we're gone, right? Because they acknowledged that he would not be able to live on his own, take care of himself, right? He would need some sort of care for the rest of his life. So $6 million was the total that they came up with. They were ultimately awarded $5.6 million. But then this second one focuses on damage caps within civil suits. And do you guys remember the exact amount that they got? It was way less than the 5.6.
1.25.
Okay.
Yeah, $1.25 million to care for their son for the entirety of his life.
Yes. So that certainly took care of some of it, but that is not something that can take care of someone with his degree of brain damage for the rest of the life. And they basically say, like, he's going to get cared for, but it's going to come out of taxpayers' dollars through Medicaid, as opposed to through the justice system and the pockets of the doctors, the insurance, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, the insurance company essentially got off the hook, and the burden of it was passed on to the taxpayer to go through Medicaid. Another thing they didn't really mention, but I just happen to know from working in healthcare, that Medicaid as a provider covers a lot of the basic services, but the options are limited for patients who rely on Medicaid. There just simply aren't as many providers who accept Medicaid. And one of the reasons for that is that the Medicaid doesn't reimburse very well. So it doesn't make a lot of financial sense for a lot of providers to take a lot of Medicaid patients. They simply won't make a lot of money. So it's a burden that gets passed on to the taxpayer, and also tends to provide fewer options for patients who need that medical care.
Good clarity. This one was really hard for me, man. It's just, he had turned 16. The twins turned 16 during the filming of this documentary. And you can see, just an immediate difference between the two. One is, and it's hard when parents say one kid is perfectly normal and one kid has brain damage. It's those are hard words to hear, but that it couldn't be more straightforward than that at the same time. And, you see the struggle, you see what the family has to go through, what the poor kid has to go through. He had eye surgery when he was 1.5. He's had 10 surgeries since then. It's just unreal. And to know that his future is up in the air as far as the care that will be provided if and when, or not if, when his parents pass away, is just a brutal thing. As a parent of kids, any of us, it's really, really hard to take.
Yeah. I wish they would have talked about it. It's not really germane to the story, but it would have been interesting to get a perspective of the brother.
Yeah.
Just like what his life has been like. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just thought that would have been interesting, but
yeah,
maybe not so important to the actual documentary.
Yeah. I think that could have been its own story, though. I think you're absolutely right. The third chapter, if you will, was that of the judge in, was it Mississippi or Missouri? Remind me.
It was Mississippi.
Mississippi. Thank you. Does someone want to summarize that, since I've been talking a lot?
Sure. It was for the Mississippi Supreme Court judge or justice, Oliver Diaz, and his, I guess it was an election to get onto the Supreme Court, and how
he was appointed and then was running for re-election.
Sure. Yep. That's right. And he has a record of ruling in favor of individuals over companies, and throughout his record. And so it came to light that during this re-election process, there was a lot of outside money, outside of the state money, coming in to fund a lot of ads and anti-campaign money to sort of bring him down. Even his opponent, they showed an interview with him, and he's like, yeah, this is bull. Like, this needs to stop. This isn't good. This isn't right.
I got the impression that his opponent wasn't trying too hard to stop that kind
Well,
of stuff.
sure. I think, yeah. But it wasn't coming from him at the same time. This obviously wasn't sort of an attack ad from one opponent to another. This was outside influence from third parties. And ultimately he ended up winning that and regaining his seat. And then as soon as that happened, then there was all these investigations, and they challenged him for bribery because he had to get a loan, to take out a loan to pay for his own marketing to sort of combat all of this outside money. And the person that co-signed this loan was a friend of his. So they said that was this conflict of interest, and he provided all of this evidence that it wasn't, that he had recused himself from every case that this person may have ever had. So ultimately he lost his seat, and it was kind of a showcase of the third point being how powerful these corporations and lobbies have become, as far as wanting to make sure that from a law standpoint, if the laws were starting to become ruled against because they were unconstitutional for all this tort reform, well, then they needed to get judges in place that would rule for companies. And so that was sort of their second prong of this attack, and showing how much money and effort they were putting into getting these corporation friendly judges in the right spots.
One thing that I thought was particularly interesting of this was the mention of the Chamber of Commerce, which I always thought, and which most of the talking heads out in the world thought that was a governmental organization, and it is not. It is basically just a lobbying group across the nation for businesses to get to do right by businesses, essentially, right? I mean, would you guys say it any differently than that?
Yeah, I was really shocked to learn that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is not a government entity.
And run by some, like, the biggest businesses, like just some pretty skeezy players in that one.
Yeah. There's a wonderful documentary, and I don't know if we'll feature it or not. If we are, cool. If not, no worries. But a documentary called 13th by Ava DuVernay about the 13th Amendment. And they talk about the prison system and the privatization of the prison system in America. And they talk about the various ways that privatization happened. And it's very much in line with kind of how the Chamber of Commerce piece and its influence on judges and the money that it put into that. Those two I see are very strong parallels. Have any of you guys seen 13th?
My wife has, and spoke incredibly highly of it.
Yeah, it's real good. I would highly recommend it. And then the final case is that of, I don't recall her first name, something Lee Jones.
Jamie
Lee Jones. Thank you.
Yeah.
Who worked for Halliburton. She was 19. She worked for them for a few months and then went overseas to Iraq, I believe. And while was there, was allegedly drugged and raped. And as a result of a arbitration clause inside of her employment contract, was not able to sue in a civil court her employer. Rather, she had to go into a private arbitration. And they talk a lot about the data of how often individuals win versus the corporations themselves win. And it was like 18 to 8,000 in the favor of the businesses or something. It was just absolutely ridiculous. The arbitrator is decided upon by the business themselves. There's a lot of reasons why an arbitrator would want to choose a business, would have significant bias towards a business versus a person. If you rule against Halliburton, what's the likelihood that they're going to ask you to arbitrate again? And if arbitration is how you make your money and you're not doing any arbitrations, well, you're not making any money, right? So they talked a lot about that, and just about how common and how pretty much standard an arbitration clause has come. And I've seen some of that when new services come out where you have to kind of like text someone or go to a certain website to basically opt out of arbitration. I didn't really realize the significance of that. I kind of knew a little bit, but certainly not as much as this. How about you guys?
Sounds like we knew nothing about this.
Yeah, indeed.
Prior to watching this documentary, I had absolutely no idea what mandatory arbitration meant. And I didn't realize that it was in so many things that I, like everyday things that I have signed on for, like credit cards, for example.
This one reminded me of like one of those conspiracy theories where it's like, oh, if you've ever handled cash money, then the government has your fingerprints and your DNA and all this stuff. But like, this is real. How many of us have signed up for things and just clicked on that? Oh, I agree to the terms of service without, who's ever going to read the terms of service?
Right.
But that's what we're agreeing to. And then as soon as you actually use the product, then that's the implied agreement or something like that. It's ridiculous how common that stuff is. And they, as they said in the documentary, they put it in the tiniest font and the extra stuff that comes in the mail that you just automatically recycle and never even look at.
Yeah.
Well, the reality is that you couldn't get, like, you wouldn't be able to have a cell phone without actually signing up for it, because they're not going to give you one without you signing it, right? Or am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, certainly the big three. I would imagine my father-in-law switched to a cell phone provider. It's a mobile virtual network operator, so it like piggybacks on top of Verizon's network, but they are their own thing. It's kind of like, how Metro PCS or Consumer Wireless or things like that can kind of have their own thing, but they're using one of the big providers. But it's essentially like a kind of like a liberal friendly, if you will, moral compass company. And so he decided to go with them. And I could see somebody like that, where they have the explicit goal of doing right by consumers and doing right by beliefs of doing that. But then again, maybe not. I don't know. It's hard to say. So Lee, I don't want to put too much pressure on you here. However, next time that you watch a documentary and you see something like to the level of like, holy crap, arbitration is a thing, could you just like text us and let us know? Because I feel like we were like maybe a few years behind where we could have been. And again, I'll try to do the same. So if I watch a documentary and it's like, holy crap, everybody needs to know this, I'll just throw it in our Slack group here, and
Yeah.
we'll do with it what we can. But let's do a little pinky swear across the internet to just try to keep ourselves informed, huh?
Well, if you want to watch another documentary that has moments like that, I would suggest How to Fix a Drug Scandal. It's on Netflix right now. It's, I believe, a 6-part documentary.
Was that one of your Remakers Mark recommends, I think?
It might have been, yeah. And that has a lot of those moments in it, like, oh, wow, this is actually possible. So yeah. I would maybe check that out.
Cool.
And I mentioned this in our sort of pre-planning, but this documentary has a very similar, although a little less flashy feel to another one that I've seen called The Corporation. So if you want to continue to be eye-opened and feel sad about everything around you, then I would watch that one as well.
Yes, please.
We could use that right now. Yeah. Seriously.
Yep. It's a equally disheartening documentary over how much is wrong.
So that is the overview of the cases in there. Now let's talk a little bit about the documentary itself. And we did touch on kind of the 4-chapter layout of this and how effective that was. Does anybody else have anything to say about that, about how it was kind of laid out or the cases that were chosen specifically?
I really liked how they led with, the McDonald's case. I think that was very deliberate, that they're kind of putting you in the mindset like you're about to see a whole bunch of stuff that was right in front of your face this entire time that you never knew about. I thought that was, very purposeful, but, a very great way to start the documentary.
And I feel like they did a good balance of tugging on heartstrings while just portraying the truth. I think they let the truth speak and then let you feel the feelings that you feel based on that truth. I don't feel like it was a particularly manipulative documentary in that way. Did you guys feel the same way? It didn't feel to me like they were really trying to, they certainly had an agenda, mind you, but it didn't feel like they were really pulling towards that in a kind of false way.
I mean, stylistically, it really was pretty plain. Like the one bit of flash that I saw in there was they would do the thing where they show a close up of some sort of document and maybe highlight some section of it.
I made in the notes that we put together in our pre-production document that Jer mentioned. So I thought the documentary was perfectly well made. It definitely felt a few years old, which it is. It was made in 2011. This isn't like an 80s thing, but like the way that they did flashy things was essentially they had taken newspaper articles and printed them on like kind of tan, almost like that kind of almost grocery bag paper that you lined your school books with in high school or whatever. They like printed it on that, and then they had like flashlights sort of off to the side, so it had semi-dramatic lighting. And then they would take just a regular old, Office Depot highlighter, and they would highlight the certain areas. And like sometimes the highlighter would like smudge it. You know what I mean? They just like left it in there. And it felt to me a little bit like Dateline NBC or something like that, like an expose or something like that. To me, that was endearing. For me, that kind of stuff, like where they're just being creative or they're following sort of, we talked about Western tropes in our last movie. I think this is like documentary tropes where you do that kind of stuff to hammer it home, where you don't just have talking head footage or you just don't have a black screen while you're making points, right? You need something in there, right? So they are doing that in a interesting way. It's just that it's not super fancy. And I like it because of that. Like I actually, within reason, especially for an expose type of thing, the glossier of a production value of something like that, the more that I am likely to be like, I don't know about this. Is this funded by big whatever, right? You know what I mean? Like it just feels true when it is of a moderate production value versus something that is much greater, right? I mean, I feel like something that Michael Moore made, I feel like when he had his Day in the Sun from a documentary standpoint, his weren't super flashy and they were super opinionated and was not at all subtle about like smacking you in the head. So I feel like this avoided all of those downsides of his documentaries in making this one a successful one. Did you all feel the same way?
Well, and speaking of documentary tropes, I appreciated that this one didn't go with dramatic music cues and slow motion black and white images and video footage and like all of that stuff to sort of overemphasize and turn things emotional. It was very
dramatic reenactments.
Yeah, well, not even yes, that too, but even pulling back from that a little bit, just to doing that sort of filmmaking idea of trying to elicit an emotional response through these sort of video tricks, and it didn't do that. It was like Kyle said, it felt like a Dateline expose of here's the facts, here's the interviews, here's what's happened, and doesn't all this suck? And that's kind of all. They just left it at that.
And they used the visuals when it was necessary to use the visuals. And I don't think that they overdid it at all.
Yeah.
Those visuals actually help because it's imagery that you're used to seeing. You're just not used to paying attention to it.
So you guys have mentioned several times feeling kind of terrible at the end of this, which, might not have been the explicit point, but they certainly wanted to influence how you felt about the role of civil justice in our world and the influence that people and corporations have on it and the disconnect between the two. It seems like we all felt pretty terrible at the end of this is sort of the state of things. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's fair.
It reminded me of why I did not like the Bush administration.
Yeah, he was featured pretty prominently there for a little while.
Yes, he was.
That was as close to a Michael Mooreism as there was, and not just because Michael Moore focused on Bush a lot. That was kind of his core era, his cohort, if you will. But yeah, just the way, and again, they just took the words that he said and they didn't spin them around like Homer Simpson and the Gummy Venus de Milo or whatever. Like it's, they just used his words straight ahead, but towards great effect in bringing home their point.
Well, I think that it just like all of the quotes from him and some of the other people talking about it from a political standpoint, it just hammers home how much we have been kind of left in the dark and been convinced of these things being okay and good, and the reality being that no, we're actually voting against our own best interests in a lot of these a lot of these things, and it's just this spin to convince us that what we're doing as a government is for your best interest and to help you, and the reality is it's often not.
It would be very interesting to follow up kind of the influence of this documentary and see sort of if changes were made as a result of that. I mean, I think ultimately, a documentary can only do so much. However, it certainly can influence public opinion. It can influence legislation. There's a lot of things that it can go towards. It would be very interesting to follow up and see if things changed at all. I have a feeling that it probably didn't, through no fault of this documentary, but just through inertia. Like so much of this has just been going on for so long that that's trying to turn a very big ship. And I just don't know if that's possible.
Well, one of the positive things that was actually in the documentary was showing that Al Franken, very early on in his career, actually was able to get some sort of change done and pass that bill to, I forget which one he was working on, but he actually was able to pass legislation to affect some change.
Yeah, it was basically working to try to absolve arbitration agreements of that sort in that particular instance of rape.
Yeah, small victory, but it's positive.
Yeah. One thing I really liked about this documentary is that it gave calls to action at the end of the movie. So it referred back to that 4-act structure, if you will, or 4 sort of case files. And they said in case 1, if you want to, basically make a change in the world, here's what you can do. So it provided some degree of summary and closure, but also here's what you can do to change. Same with 2, 3, and 4. So I like that. Sometimes documentaries do a great job of making us feel bad and presenting information, but don't give us much to act on. And admittedly, some of that is just laziness on our part as viewers. Sometimes you just need to take the next step. But I greatly appreciated that, where it wasn't just a passive thing. It was an active call to action, and providing that was good.
Yeah, I meant to say that in my notes that I really liked that there was an actual, we've got you worked up, now here's what to do with that.
Yeah. Yep. Super smart, super thoughtful. All right. Finally, let us do our rating and scale of the documentary. So as usual, we'll do 1 through 10, 1 being worst documentary ever, 10 being super duper duper good, and the scale of your choosing. Lee, you chose this movie. Let's have you go first for the rating and scale.
I will give it 8 out of 10 coffee lids.
There you go. Very good. Mark Joesting, how about you? What is your rating and scale?
I too like this quite a lot, and I think I'm going to give it 8 out of 10 slander campaigns.
Unfortunately pertinent. Yes, indeed. Andy Wicks, how about you? What would be your rating and scale?
I also enjoyed this very much. I'll give it 8.5 out of 10. It's hard to find a humorous rating scale out of a film like this. Not going to lie.
That's fair.
So I'm just going to say 8.5 out of 10 torts.
Delicious. Jeremy Nilsson, how about you?
I did like this as well. I am going to give it 7.5 completely fictional John Grisham stories that were very much true.
Nice.
Very nice.
I'll go last here. I will give it 7.87 punches to Karl Rove's face, which is not nearly enough punches to Karl Rove's face for what he deserves, but it is an accurate rating of the film. So, alas, I'll just have to keep looking for reasons to punch Karl Rove in the face, because my God, does he deserve a punch in the face?
Yes.
Or several. That face is just so punchable. Man, unreal. And I'm not a face puncher. I don't think I've ever punched anyone in the face for real. I would punch Karl Rove in the face.
I would punch him in the face and give him a wedgie.
Yes. He would deserve that several times over. Oy vey.
Then a wedgie to the face.
Yes.
An atomic wedgie.
An atomic wedgie. Nice. All right. Remaker's Mark is a proud member of the Math is Hard Network. To find out more information about this podcast or any other podcast on the network, check us out at mathishard.net. There you will find show notes with links to all of the people, movies, and links discussed in this episode. This information is also attached to the show file in the podcast client of your choice. You can find us anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Google Play, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review Remaker's Mark, which would mean the world to us. And now we are on YouTube. Just search for Remaker's Mark. We are on Facebook. Search for Remaker's Mark. Twitter, @Remaker's Mark. And Instagram, @Remaker's Mark Podcast. So please join in the discussion there as well. So thank you, gentlemen. For our next item that we will be discussing will be do the right thing. And we are very excited about that. So until that time, gentlemen, may the force be with you.
And also with you.
What did you think you knew about the McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit in mention here?
Sorry.